we put in charge of governing us a bunch of muppets. Well, Nick, if they were going to make it realistic, they would have got someone like Daniel Craig to play me, if I'm honest. I didn't really care who claimed credit for Brexit. I just wanted Britain to be out of the European Union. I don't really care who claims credit for controlling our borders. I just want our borders controlled.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Nick Talks. This episode's amazing guest is a gentleman you might know because I've known of him now for probably about 10, 15 years. It's Douglas Carswell. He was a Tory MP, then he became a UKIP MP. He was a big name behind the Brexit referendum, but I'll let him talk about that. So first of all, welcome Douglas to the show.
Nick, thanks so much for having me on. It's great.
Thank you for taking time out doing this, because for what people might not know, this is in the middle of between Christmas and New Year. So thank you for taking some time away from your family, your friends, having a drink, eating too much, and indulging in those mince pies.
There's nothing I would rather do than be here with you. So I should be thanking you.
I've not spoken to anybody yet who was at the heart of the Brexit referendum, who was an integral figure, who knows what was going on, who was pushing it for years. I mean, I've always been a Brexiteer since I was I'd say a mid-teenager, leaving school, going to college. I didn't know why I disliked the EU, but I knew I did. So when the referendum came along in 2016, it was the easiest cross I ever put in a box. But you were there, you were pushing for it, you were fighting for it. What can you say about that period in time?
Well, I was against Britain being in the European Union long before I ever got involved in politics. In fact, it's the reason I did get involved in politics. I could see that organizing a continent of 500 million people by top-down design was going to be a disaster for that continent. So I advocated for Britain to leave the European Union. When I first stood up in the House of Commons, my maiden speech, I called for Britain to leave the European Union. That was back in 2005. And there were a grand total of 6 MPs in the entire House of Commons who believed in what then became known as Brexit. And I basically went into politics to try to get Britain out. I advocated for a referendum. I had to switch from the Conservatives and join UKIP. Famously resigning my seat in a by-election for UKIP in Clacton, now Nigel Farage's constituency. I pushed for it. I co-founded Vote Leave, the official campaign, with Dan Hannan and Matt Elliott. And yeah, it was the reason I was in British politics. And I'm absolutely love to talk about the inside of it. I would just say one thing. The referendum, I've met an awful lot of people who are keen to talk about the critical role they played in the Brexit referendum, which is great. It's good. It's good that lots of people feel a sense of ownership of it. But I think viewers should treat with caution any one individual who claims that they were responsible for Brexit or the Brexit referendum. It was, after all, a decision taken by millions of Brits. So if you're one of those people who voted for Brexit, thank you. You were as much responsible for it as anyone else.
No, and I agree with that. We can talk about battles, we can talk about wars, we can talk about world wars. One person doesn't win a war. One person can contribute to the winning of the war, but they need so many other people alongside them contributing as well for that victory. Now, Brexit is happened now. Let's not discuss the ins and outs of what happened there. What I'd like to ask you now is, I'm glad we've left. I would never want to rejoin. I'm the first to say that Brexit's been a failure, but not because we've left the EU. For me personally, it's been a failure because the benefits we could have got from leaving the EU have never been grasped. They're sat there on a shelf. It's Christmas, so they're our Christmas presents for the future, wrapped up on a shelf that someone can grab down at some point in the future. That's how I'm looking at it. Am I wrong? Am I mistaken?
You're absolutely right. I mean, leaving the European Union gave us the opportunity to run our country in a very different way to the European Union model. The European Union model is a failing model. It's very highly taxed, very highly regulated. leaving the European Union ought to have allowed us to do things very differently, to become a much more free market society, to become a country in which you don't need permission to create wealth from politicians and officials. Instead, tragically, although we got self-government, we put in charge of governing us a bunch of muppets. People like Michael Gove and Boris Johnson, who are notionally in charge of the Vote Leave campaign, not only failed to use the Brexit opportunity, I mean, look at just what happened after winning the referendum. The day after we won the referendum, both Boris Johnson and Michael Gove made a speech at the Vote Leave campaign HQ, and they didn't really seem to have anything to say. It would be obvious that they should then take up the role of governing the country and implement some of the Vote Leave policies. Again, they failed to do that. They got into some petty spat, as a consequence of which they put in the calamitous Theresa May, which led to 2 or 3 years of disaster. Even after all of that, in late 2019, when Boris Johnson finally won a majority to make Brexit happen, in office, he proved abysmally disappointing. He implemented an energy policy that has basically priced the UK economy out of growth. He failed to take advantage of free trade policies, allowing officials to dictate what a free trade agreement ought to look like rather than what it should be. Again and again and again, we found that post-Brexit ministers simply weren't up to the job of governing. And I think this speaks to a wider problem. When you as a country gain self-government, if you haven't had it for 40 years, which we hadn't, lots of the basic elemental parts of statecraft, of how to govern a country, have been forgotten. And now that we've got self-government, we need to figure out how to reform government so that we're capable of governing ourselves, but governing ourselves well. In order to try to achieve this, I set up a project called the Good Governance Project. I could see what was coming, having quit my seat in the House of Commons after Brexit was secured. I set up something called the Good Governance Project, and we advised Boris Johnson, both in opposition and in government, on how to re-engineer Whitehall, how to make sure that the dysfunctional British administrative state was up to the job of government. And I'm afraid to say Boris Johnson and all the rest of them had zero interest in doing that. I could see that post-Brexit, we had a series of Muppet ministries in charge. And I'm afraid they singularly failed to take advantage of Brexit. It's a dismal story, but that doesn't mean that Brexit is wrong. Eventually, we will figure out how to govern Britain competently and wisely. So, don't despair. It was never going to be easy becoming a self-governing independent country. We just need to figure out how to put competent people in office. And, former newspaper columnists like Gove and Johnson are perhaps not the best people to have running your country.
Let me run this by you. Out of all the prime ministers and governments in my lifetime, I'm 50, am I now 56? Boris Johnson is the politician I've come to despise the most. Not because I disagree with anything he said, but because he's the only politician who sold me a lie. I feel a fool. I feel let down. I feel like an idiot that I bought into his rhetoric in 2019. He told me he was a fun, lovable version of Winston Churchill. He told me he loved this country. He told me he was going to deliver Brexit. He was going to make us great again, put the great back into Great Britain. And he got into power. And for the life of me, I can't name a thing he did apart from everything that was wrong. He seemed to do what his wife told him. He seemed not to want any make decisions. He seemed to be embarrassed that he fought for Brexit, became prime minister, and now went, oh, crap, I'm sorry I got involved in any of this.
I think there's an explanation for this, and I'm afraid this is quite difficult to stomach. But with the perspective of time and hindsight, I think one can only really understand the actions of Boris Johnson and Michael Gove by really, they came out before the referendum to lead Vote Leave. Number one, the Vote Leave machine had been created long before either Boris or Gove had emerged to lead it. People like Matthew Elliott and Dan Hannan and Dominic Cummings had worked very, very hard to create this disciplined, focused machine, Vote Leave. When Boris and Gove came out to lead it, my hunch, I'm afraid to say, is that they were expecting Vote Leave to lose. And what they were really doing by coming out to support Vote Leave was to position themselves for future advancement in a Cameroon government. Having led the unsuccessful Leave campaign, I think their calculation was they would be indispensable for David Cameron, who could then say, right, we need unity. I'm going to bring in some of these token leavers. And I think that was really their game plan. That explains why the morning after winning, they were clueless as to what to say. It explains why they had no game plan for running the country and allowed the cataclysmic Theresa May in charge. It explains why when eventually they did hold high office post-Brexit, they ended up implementing a policy agenda that owed nothing to the origins of Euroscepticism or Vote Leave. I think they were opportunistic, and fair dues to them. Their opportunism paid off, but ultimately I think they were found out because they were, politicians often say they suffer from imposter syndrome. I think in the case of Boris or Michael Gove, if they do suffer from imposter syndrome, it's probably fairly accurate and well earned. They ended up in positions of great authority and not knowing what to do with it. But enough of them. They're a rather sad and sorry episode in British politics. What remains true after the career of these people is long gone is that Britain is free to make its own laws. Britain is free to take a new path. Britain is free to learn the lessons of how not to do it, how not to do it on immigration, how not to do it on taxation and regulation, all these other things. Britain doesn't need to seek the permission of bureaucrats in Brussels and other countries to make these decisions. And critically, Britain can no longer blame foreigners for homegrown mistakes. And I hope this acts as a catalyst. Eventually, we will see a centre-right force emerge in Britain. It may be the Conservative Party, it may be the Reform Party, it may be another. But eventually, we will see a party emerge that speaks to the Conservative majority in the country, that is capable of delivering what people voted for in the referendum. Boy, is it needed. But I'm optimistic. We're in a ditch at the moment, but when you're in a ditch, the only way is out.
No, I completely agree. I'm very optimistic. Things have been changing this last few years, and I can feel the change in the air. I can feel the British people have had enough and they want a change.
The single most important thing that's happened is the ability of people like you and me on shows like this to talk about these ideas. For generations, the media was controlled by the kind of people that edited the Today program. Remember what that was? Newsnight, remember what that was? Thanks to Elon Musk taking over Twitter, which has had a knock-on effect on YouTube and Facebook and all the other social media platforms, it is now possible for you and me and people like us to talk about and set our own agenda, free from people whose obsession is the soap opera of Westminster. This means not only can we talk about what's gone wrong with government, why the one-party system we seem to have at the moment is such a disaster, we can begin to really interrogate things like multiculturalism. Is that something that is credible and viable? We can begin to discuss things like immigration. At what point have we, the British people, been asked whether or not we want millions of people from outside the West to settle in our country? We can discuss these things. We can talk about the criminal justice system. We can assess whether or not judges who hold enormous authority are competent in exercising that. We can begin to discuss the criminal justice system. Is it right that people who commit very serious offences are given very small, lenient sentences? What's really significant in Britain and what is really galvanizing the Conservative movement is not any institution, new or old, in Westminster. It's not any party, new or old, in Westminster. It's not Kemi Badenoch or Nigel Farage. It is this kind of discussion we're having. That is what is going to drive Conservative change in Britain. And that is what makes me optimistic.
No, fantastic. I'm glad you've said that. I want to talk about modern politics now, today's politics. But before we move on, not one of my favorite films, but a film I thoroughly enjoy. I've watched it about 6 times now in the last 5 years. Is Brexit: The Uncivil War. Now, it's not a documentary; it's a film. I give them some artistic license. I'm sure they've changed things to make it more entertaining. You're heavily portrayed in that film by an actor. How true is that film, or is it a load of rubbish? Is it pure entertainment? I want it from someone who actually knows.
Well, Nick, if they were going to make it realistic, they would have got someone like Daniel Craig to play me, if I'm honest. But no, I think sadly they portray me as a slightly sort of goofy, lanky, balding chap. So I'm afraid it's all too realistic in that regard. But no, I mean, it's a bit right. For example, at the opening scene is me and Matt Elliott in the National Gallery, talking about not the National Gallery, Tate Britain, talking about what to do and how to force a referendum and all the rest of it. And that happened. We did used to meet there. It was a place in Westminster where you can guarantee that no whip is ever going to be in an art gallery. So we were able to plot in peace without arousing suspicions. But I think the a number of failings. I think the single biggest failing is that it marginalizes the role of two individuals who were actually absolutely instrumental to Britain leaving the European Union. The first is Dan Hannan, a very good friend of mine. He and Matt Elliott, and to a much lesser extent, those two individuals founded Vote Leave. In fact, going back further, those two individuals are responsible for popularizing the idea that a referendum was the mechanism by which we needed to leave. In fact, Dan spotted this sort of 20 years ago, long before anyone else came along. He really understood that the mechanism to extract us from the European Union was to force a referendum. So, I mean, I think their role was slightly marginalized. It also rather exaggerates the role of Dominic Cummings. I mean, the person who wrote the script spent a lot of time with Dominic. And don't get me wrong, when Dominic Cummings was hired by Matt Elliott and Dan and myself, we had a bit of money and we hired him to start doing some focus groups on what people thought about Europe and attitudes to Europe and how you might begin to build a 50+1% coalition for leaving. Dominic played a key role, but he wasn't quite the architect of the change that perhaps he and others have suggested he was. I'll give you a specific example. The film portrays him as somehow mystically divining what the people of Jaywick in Essex wanted. And this was used to try to sort of capture this notion that we were tapping into the disaffected voters, the voters who no one spoke for, and magically mobilizing. Well, no disrespect to anyone, but actually it was in my constituency, Jaywick, and it was techniques that I and Dan and Matt perfected, and it was the Clacton by-election in August 2014 that secured a 75% majority of the votes in Jaywick. And it was the Clacton by-election where we started to begin to use the tools of creating email lists and lookalike groups on social media. So, I mean, I think also people are sort of quick to claim credit for tapping into the disaffected, what I think rather condescendingly subsequently were known as red wall or blue wall voters, the sort of disaffected working class voters. But I have to say, I think it was actually Clacton where we first mastered this art. And we did this sometime before those who claim authorship of all of this were on board. But, it's a film, it's entertaining. I mean, it portrays me as drinking a bottle of champagne. Rather boringly, I'm teetotal. Perhaps if the people who wrote the script had spent a bit of time with me, they may have known that. But I think it over exaggerates the role of Dominic, who played an important role, but not the be all and the end all role. And it underestimates the key role of Dan and Matt. But I think actually history is rewriting that version of events, and increasingly people are beginning to understand that Matt Elliott and Dan Hannan and Daniel Hodgson and one or two others who've been in the shadows were actually pretty central to getting Britain out of the European Union. So yeah, it was a first draft of history, but it doesn't tell the full story.
Right, thank you for that. I wasn't sure if it was purely made up. Obviously, it sounds like it was based on certain facts, but then a lot of artistic license to make it a 1.5 hour film.
Yeah. It was Dominic spending a lot of time talking to the scriptwriter. I think if the scriptwriter had talked to one or two others, they may have got a more holistic view of these things. But hey, it's flattering to have a movie made about something you did in politics. I mean, they say that most political careers end in failure. I quit Commons of my own choice, having accomplished Brexit, and got to feature in a movie, albeit not one in which I was portrayed by Daniel Craig.
Yeah. Well, we always can't have it our own way. Cheers for that. Let's jump to modern day. This Labour government I knew was going to be bad. I knew they were going to fail. I just never thought they were going to be this bad, this fast, and fail within 5 months of getting into office. Is that a fair assessment?
Boy, is that a very good assessment. I mean, I assumed there would be a few years of honeymoon for Starmer. My sort of memory of 1997 is that for a couple of years he would sort of walk on water. Well, I think he fell flat on his face in a puddle on day one. But what is so alarming is that although he is making half a dozen really bad decisions and on half a dozen key strategic issues is heading in the wrong direction, there doesn't at the moment seem to be a clear alternative, because in a weird way, what Starmer is doing is doubling down on the strategic errors and mistakes and misjudgments and bad policy of his predecessors. And I want to talk about this in half a dozen different areas. One of the reasons why Britain is in a sorry economic state, I'm talking to you from a country, the United States, where in 2007, the per capita GDP between the two countries was roughly the same, give or take. Since 2007, the economy of the United States, the GDP output per person in the United States has grown by 20%. So since 2007, people are pretty much 20% richer. In Britain, the growth since 2007 has been 4.5%. So not even a quarter of the growth in the United States. Now, to understand the mess Britain's in, you've got to ask, why since 2007 has Britain so underperformed the rest of the world, particularly the United States? 6 basic reasons. Number one, energy. Britain has a economically suicidal energy policy that basically means electricity and gas are so expensive. The problem is that this was done under the Conservatives. Labour is now making it worse. Labour under Miliband is making the energy system even worse. But the problem is, because it was done by the Conservatives for 14 years, there's no clear alternative. The same with the other reason why Britons are growing poor is because too many people in Britain work in the public sector, and public sector has low productivity. If you want to create growth, one of the things you need to do is move people from the public sector to the private sector. Again, I'm afraid to say that the Conservatives made a really bad job of this, and Labour came in and is making it worse. They've given these very generous pay settlements to the public sector, and they're hiring more people in the public sector, so they're doubling down on a Conservative error. Again, the NHS, Britain is told that, they've got this wonderful free system of socialised healthcare. It's not great. It really isn't. You pay enormous amounts for it through taxation, and it's not there when you need it. Poor people in Mississippi, people living in the Mississippi Delta, have better cancer survival rates with the American system than Brits do with your so-called wonderful free NHS. You're not getting value for money from your NHS, which is consuming so much of your national wealth and has such poor productivity. You can't grow economically and prosper economically until you address that. The fourth reason is the folly of the British Treasury, which for years has told ministers that the way to secure economic growth is to import people. This belief that somehow immigration will generate wealth. Well, it just doesn't add up. It doesn't make sense. What you do is you import people with low skills, and you become poorer because the number of people grows, but the size of the economy doesn't grow by the same amount. So you become poorer. A fifth failure is that the British economy has been strangled by governments for the past 20 years with micro-regulation. You need a permit to do pretty much anything in Britain today. This strangles innovation. It means that good luck to producing anyone like Elon Musk in Britain. Anyone like Elon Musk with his talents in Britain would end up working for the council rather than building rockets or cars. Now, to try to counter the dead weight effect of all this regulation, consecutive British governments have opened the taps up with low, cheap loans, easy money and credit, and eventually you can't do that anymore. And Britain is, I think, under Starmer, reaching the end of the road as to how you can use monetary stimulus to offset this sclerotic economy. And the sixth and final reason is you've got a system of government in Britain that's basically dysfunctional. You've got a civil service that doesn't listen to ministers. It does what it wants. It can get rid of ministers. That's essentially what happened to Boris Johnson. He was sacked by civil servants on the question of whether or not he ate a birthday cake during COVID. You've got a dysfunctional system of government. You've got an administrative state in Britain that is just appalling. Now, all of these factors are Conservatives, but Labour is doubling down on all of them. On all of those things are getting worse under Labour, not better. So, if you really want to fix the country, forget Starmer. He's only going to make things worse. What you need is a centre-right political movement that repudiates 14 years of atrocious Conservative legacy on the economy and comes in and takes a scorched earth approach to this. And the first institution it should take a scorched earth approach to is the Treasury and the Cabinet Office. No generation of Britons will prosper and become rich until you have a leader that deals with the mandarins in Whitehall the way Margaret Thatcher dealt with the NUM. You must recognize that the people in the upper echelons of the British state need to be removed from office. And you need far-reaching radical reform. You could almost say, having achieved home rule with Brexit, you now need to change who rules you at home.
I agree with everything you just said then. Who's going to do it? That's the question we're all asking. Is it Nigel Farage, who you know? Is it Reform? Are they just the next vehicle to take us closer? Or are they the fox in disguise, which is more of the same? What's your take on that?
As always in politics, I don't really care who does it. I want it done. I didn't really care who claimed credit for Brexit. I just wanted Britain to be out of the European Union. I don't really care who claims credit for controlling our borders. I just want our borders controlled. Don't ever underestimate Nigel Farage. People gloatingly say, well, he's only got half a dozen MPs in the House of Commons. That can change. That can change pretty quickly. Look at what happened to the Liberal Party of Gladstone in the early 20th century. Don't underestimate Nigel Farage, and don't underestimate what they could do if they learnt how to use data properly. If they learnt how to use data the way we did in the Clacton by-election in 2014. One of my great frustrations having joined UKIP is that the techniques I used to win my seat in 2014 were never adopted by others in UKIP. I suspect that Reform has learnt the lessons of that, and some of the people around Nigel now will understand the importance of using data, and they'll know how to use data, and they will know how to do targeted messaging. So don't underestimate that. I still think the most likely force for doing this will be the Conservative Party, but I really want Kemi Badenoch to do well. I worry though. I worry that the Conservative Party has, for 15 years, because of David Cameron's A-list, selected a lot of diversity hires. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying Kemi Badenoch is a diversity hire, but there are plenty of diversity hires within the Conservative Party. Lightweight mediocrities who were parachuted into safe seats, the remnants of the Conservative Party, the last few seats, or the handful of, the 100 or so seats that they held on to. There's not a great deal of talent amongst them. Those that are talented often haven't been allowed into positions previously to show their talent. They've been kind of marginalized because there's a lot of lightweight dross in the Conservative Parliamentary Party. And I worry if going to have time to turn around. It urgently needs candidate selection in key seats. It urgently needs to allow natural Conservatives in different parts of the country to come into the party. I mean, never forget how Richard Tice, who is doing a fantastic job for reform and is in danger of turning reform into a real election-winning force. My understanding is that Richard Tice only left the Conservative Party because he was barred from standing as a candidate for diversity reasons for the mayoral race in London. 20 years of doing that means that there are an awful lot of very talented people who are no longer on your side as a Conservative Party. And the Conservative Party needs to find a way of getting people like that back on board. There's a huge opportunity there. I suspect that Starmer's Labour Party will suffer a catastrophic defeat. But Conservatives, people who believe in Britain, people who want to see the country do well, need to hope that somehow a galvanizing Conservative force that not only wins elections but knows what to do in office. This is what was so disappointing about Liz Truss. Having finally got someone who at least spoke the language of what needed to be done, didn't seem to have a clue how to do it. So you need to see a Conservative movement win seats, but also understand how to begin to deconstruct the leftist state, how to begin to, in Gramscian terms, reverse march through the institutions, how to identify and isolate and remove from public life officials who have a leftist series of assumptions. Conservative Party hasn't even begun to think in these terms. Just reflect on the fact that, sorry, I'm meandering a little bit here, but just reflect on the fact that the Conservative Party used the power of patronage to put leftists in charge of institutions. We need to be almost revolutionary, so that when we have a majority in Parliament, we utilize that to take on and to take out the leftists who sadly are doing all too well under Starmer, but frankly did all too well when Conservatives were notionally in office but never in power.
I cannot see the Tories doing that in the next 4 years. I think Kenny Badenoch is an interim leader. They need a civil war in the Tory party. That's not even started yet. So 4 years from now, we may be at general election time again. Nobody wants Labour. Most people don't want the Tories. And a lot of people will not want reform for many reasons. The only solution I can see at the moment, unless reform really take off over the next couple of years, and I hope they do, if they don't do that, then the only possibility would be a Tory reform coalition. If that, I can't see them wanting that, as in the Tories, because that's a death nail for them. Even though it'll be short-term gain, they're then legitimizing their number one competitor. I just don't know where this goes.
Well, look at the precedent of Canada. I mean, when Nigel and others set up the Reform Party, they consciously used the phrase reform because there was a party in Canada called Reform. The Canadian Conservatives, under a disastrous leader like Kim Campbell, a sort of Theresa May, Rishi Sunak combo, think of her as that. She was an utter disaster. They were down to a handful of seats. An alternative called Reform was set up. And eventually the two parties merged. But what that required is the traditional Conservative Party to allow people who had been in Reform to come in. And in fact, I think Steve Harper and some of the most successful future Conservative leaders came into the Conservative movement through Reform. So, the Conservative Party both could benefit from some kind of deal. You need to remember, though, that this is going to be made difficult in part to Boris Johnson's folly and arrogance and conceit. Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage came to an understanding, and I know this because I was party to some of the third parties involved, came to an understanding not to stand in several seats in 2019. Nigel very magnanimously stood down Reform candidates, many of whom, or Brexit Party candidates, many of whom were furious at the time, and got them to stand down in 2019. That was instrumental in securing Boris Johnson his massive landslide win in 2019. They forgot that on day one in office. They didn't thank Nigel. They didn't bring Nigel in. They didn't offer the Brexit Party seats in the House of Lords, for example. They didn't offer to bring them in and help and advise in the Brexit negotiations. I think because of that, a lot of people in the Reform Party would be very, very reluctant to strike a deal with the Conservative Party, knowing how atrociously Boris Johnson's Conservatives treated them after the 2019 victory. So, yes, I can see the logic in why it should happen and needs to happen, but I think events have some way to go before either side will be ready for that.
Yeah, I can't see the Tories doing it because I know the Tories only care about power. They don't care about the country. We've got 14 years proof that they don't care about the country.
To be fair, some. I mean, there are some in the Conservative Party who, and Kemi Badenoch may be one of them, who think of politics as more than just a parlour game. The problem is that for a generation, the Conservatives have been dominated by a group of effete, often ex-Oxbridge student politicians who think of politics as a parlour game. David Cameron, George Osborne, Michael Gove. And it's all about positioning and all about getting one up on everyone else and all about clever games and all about, political cross-dressing. And it's destroyed the reputation of the Conservative Party as a principled free market party that believes in something. But, it is possible to drive people like that out of the Conservative movement. It is possible to find principled Conservatives and bring them back into the fold. A key moment will be, is Kemi Badenoch taking counsel from the Michael Gove type dilettante Conservatives who put the party and the country in the ditch, or is she going to take counsel from the ordinary Conservative chairmen and chairwomen, Conservative associations up and down the country, who frankly do believe in something? So don't write her off. Don't write the party off.
We will see. We've got an exciting year in 2025, and let's be honest, anybody who tells you what's going to happen next year is a fool of a liar because it's too volatile.
I don't know how much longer we've got, but I think one thing slightly changes things. You'll notice I'm talking to you from the United States, where I've lived for the past 4 years. It's great to be in a part of the world where conservative ideas are actually appreciated by conservative politicians, and politicians believe in liberty and limited government and lower taxes and school choice. So I made this place my home. Now, a lot of Britons, or I should say a lot of political leaders in Britain, have this extraordinary sort of inferiority complex about the United States. Perhaps they spent too much time watching The West Wing or whatever. But they look at what's happening in the United States and they try to sort of emulate it. They call the garden in Downing Street, which isn't a rose garden, the Rose Garden, because the White House has a rose garden. They adopt the language of United States politics about spin and spin doctors and all the rest of it. I think because of that, the impact of Donald Trump and the impact of a Trump 2.0 administration, with people like Musk fundamentally changing the size and the shape of the federal administration, the radical deregulation they're going to do, the new system of border control and immigration control they look likely to implement, I think a lot of this might actually galvanize some of those so-called conservative types. It certainly shifts the so-called Overton window of what is and what isn't politically acceptable debate. I think as Britons look across the Atlantic and see a fellow English-speaking country sorting itself out, cutting its government, reducing the alphabet soup of bureaucracy in its capital city, controlling its borders, radically freeing the economy from red tape, I think that might actually galvanize people in Britain and in the conservative movement in Britain to say, why the heck can't we do something similar?
Oh, I totally agree. I think we're going to look across the pond next year and we're going to go, why can't we do that? Why can't we drill? Why can't we deport? Why can't we reduce taxes? Why can't we start more businesses? Why can't we reduce regulation? I think that's going to be the constant rhetoric over next year.
Yeah. Why is the United States, which has a variety of states, Mississippi being the poorest state in the union. Why does Mississippi, the poorest state in America, now have a higher living standard than Britain? Why is it that blue collar workers in America on fairly sort of skilled jobs have a higher income than professionals in the United Kingdom? Why does the manager of local Buckley's here in Mississippi earn more than the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom? Perhaps it's time to change course and reject the Blairite consensus of the past 30 years that has done so much to run Britain and run Britain into the ground. Perhaps we need a post-Blairite approach to politics. And that means having conservative leaders who don't think of themselves as the heir to Blair, who never accommodated and compromised with the Blairite ascendancy, but are radical and revolutionary, and in the spirit of a grocer's daughter from Grantham, are willing to radically change the country and drag it into the 21st century.
Perfect place to end, Douglas. Thank you very much. But before we go, what are you doing in Mississippi?
I run something called the Mississippi Center for Public Policy. We are a really small but really influential, I think actually we're probably one of the leading free market think tanks in the southern United States. We've managed to get the state income tax down to 4%, flat 4%. Everyone pays 4%. School choice. We are now creating a system so every child in the public school system in Mississippi has a dedicated number of dollars, and hopefully they'll be able to take those dollars to any school of their choice. Free market innovation in education happening in Mississippi. Lots of other things we're doing. Labor market deregulation. Mississippi's growing. Amazon has just announced a 12 billion investment 10 miles up the road from me. That's the kind of exciting economic thing happening here in Mississippi. Come visit Mississippi. You'll love it. Mississippi's more than the river and more than steamboats. It's rapidly turning into a cross between sort of Texas and Tennessee and Florida. You'll love it.
No, fantastic. I might be in America next year traveling around. So if I am, I shall drop you a line and let's see if we can hook up. Douglas, thank you for coming on my show. I really appreciate it. It's Christmas. You've taken time out. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Well done for what you do. Keep doing it.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Thanks.